Hey you guys, so this is an interesting turn of events for the deck profile that I'm putting up here, as this time people have been actively asking to see the deck profile that I'm about to put off, because I'm not just spouting off a new idea, because check me out. Won this the other day is I piloted this deck that I'm about to show you to first place in the first Final Fantasy TCG tournament that was held at the Square Enix headquarters, and I had such a blast. It was a really good day, but in all fairness I was actually really nervous about going into a tournament, especially like where I'm trying to set up a reputation for somebody who knows what they're talking about when it comes to these card games. And I was really worried because I was running a deck that's a little bit outside the box, and I really wouldn't want to kind of crap out, go like O and X, and kind of have it turn out that all the ideas that I put up on YouTube get to a point where everyone goes, well, this guy doesn't really know what he's talking about. But luckily, that turned out not to be the case. Though not without struggle, because I definitely came up against some really hard matchups and some decks that were really awesome, some really well-established play styles, and I'll get into those more when we look at the deck properly. Now this is the first deck that I've built that I really kind of wanted to give a name to, because, you know, it's kind of got a bit of a meaning to me now. And I decided to name the deck Save the Queen. And I wanted to name it for multiple reasons. Now this, you know, Save the Queen was always a weapon I was always really excited to pick up in any Final Fantasy that it was in. Probably due to it being, you know, Beatrix's weapon in Final Fantasy IX, and anyone who's watched any of my videos knows by now that Final Fantasy IX is my favourite game in the series, by far. But it's also a really apt name for the deck, because the play style of it is that the deck has a centerpiece, which happens to be Ultimecia, who's definitely a queen in my eyes. And, you know, she was my favourite card from the second I saw her. On the first day of release, I bought my box with my partner, we opened it up, I saw Ultimecia and I saw it and I just thought, this card is amazing. And then I started looking online and no one seemed to care about her, so I'm like, I'm picking up a playset of this card right now because this card is insanely good. And she was really cheap, and I've looked online these past couple days and suddenly everybody wants her and she's like tripled in value, and that's a little bit weird to me. I actually have a spare Ultimecia, so I'm planning on perhaps doing a giveaway or something on this channel, so I mean stay tuned for that. I just need to kind of work out how that kind of thing works, so bear with me. But anyways, going back to the name of the deck, Save the Queen was apt because I felt that she was the centerpiece, and a lot of the cards in the deck are chosen for the deck because of their synergy with the queen of the deck, which is Ultimecia. You could also, if you really wanted to, refer to me as the queen that needs saving, if you want to think of it that way. That wasn't my intention when I kind of thought of the name, but hey, if the glass slipper fits. Anyways, let's get on with it. We're gonna, you know, go straight into the deck now because it's what you're all kind of wanting to see. And I've gone with something that's a little more backup heavy, with 20 forwards, which is less than usual, 21 backups, and 9 summons. Now this deck is intended to be a hard control deck. You do not play this deck if you plan on making friends when you play these games. As I said in my last video, my mini tournament report, I have to make up for being a control player by being as nice a guy as I possibly can to my opponents and trying to make sure that we're fun and we're kikiing and everything's all good. But I love control. I love interactive games. I like making it so that your opponent has to kind of play with you, or you're playing with the player, not their deck, because that's my favourite kind of thing to do. Anyways, now let's just get straight into the cards then. Now you can see just over here that I've put all of the cards up at once, because I kind of wanted to make sure that if you just wanted to kind of get on the video, look at the deck list, and then go, okay, that looks good, I'm going to try it out, build it up and go, it's right here for you. And I've also made sure to put the code of the card next to the name of it, because I felt that the way that I was doing it before, you know, somebody at the tournament actually kind of mentioned to me, hey, why don't you kind of try putting the codes on next to the names of your cards? And I thought, do you know what, actually that's a really good idea. It makes it more cohesive and it makes it a lot easier to locate them, especially when newer sets come out. So that's what I've done. Now, the first thing here is the centerpiece of the deck, as I said, which is Ultimecia. This card is so good, so good. The reason behind me picking her is because the way this game works, having your guys come in dulled is almost like setting your opponent back a turn. If you have Ultimecia down, there is nothing your opponent can do that next turn to you unless they kill her first. If your opponent's on 6 damage and you have an Ultimecia down and they have no board, you have almost 95% of the time won that game without a shadow of a doubt. And it's because anything that they play can't block you next turn, which is almost as important as the fact that they can't attack you. But they can't attack you even if they have haste, because they come in dulled. Haste is something that is quite prevalent in this game, and I think that having a card that just shuts the entire mechanic down is extremely important. And then I decided to go with 3 copies of Geomancer in the forward slot for water, because I thought this card was brilliant. It's just a really good blocker. It can block. It's like the perfect card to block Zidane and Squall. Legendary Squall in Ice is a 6k guy, and yes, if you block it, he'll get steal 6k to something else. But most of the guys in this deck are actually quite large. So to have something that can answer Squall without you losing any type of card advantage, because you draw a card when it dies, is really, really good. Not only that, but I'm running copies of Kefka in the deck. I'm running other things that are just, benefit from you dying. Cloud of Darkness. If you play a Cloud of Darkness, which is actually the next card on this list, you have a Geomancer out, you just destroy the Geomancer because you lose nothing for losing it. And if your opponent has overextended, then they lose a lot more than you do, especially if you get to draw cards out of it. Speaking of Cloud of Darkness, I found that there are a lot of decks that are very heavily reliant on having more than one guy out. One of the decks I was most afraid of when I went into the tournament is the FF10 combo deck, where you'll get Yoona, Riku, Pain, and Tidus out. And I figured that having as many kind of board wipe capabilities as possible without skewing the deck too far in that direction was quite important. So I take a single copy of Cloud of Darkness just to kind of punish those kind of strategies while keeping my Ultimecia alive, or my Cloud if I have him out, or Guy if I'm up against an ice deck. But there's lots of kind of good synergies with Cloud of Darkness, and having Geomancer sort of sitting next to it makes things even better. Now with the backups and stuff, and Jesus Christ, oh, do excuse me, my hair is an absolute state at the moment because I need to get it cut and recoloured. Anyways, the water backups in here, I decided to go with 2 copies of Yard Rosh because you want 2 drops in your backup slots, and 4 to 6, I would try and get as many as you can in there, but I understand at the end of the day sometimes you want the bigger effects. But Yard Rosh protects a lot of your cards from backup destruction, particularly things like Sephiroth, who I did come across a few times over the course of the day. And anyone who says that 8-drop Sephiroth is bad, I can't agree with, because I think he's just a 2-for-1. He's just very, very strong. So to underestimate him would be naive. So I decided to put in a card that was a safeguard against him. And Archer and he doesn't really help against Hecaton here, but in all fairness, I didn't actually come across that many of Hecaton while I was playing, which really surprised me. But the things that he protects are just very, very useful, so it's just a solid 2-drop. The other solid 2-drop is the Geomancer. So there's obviously 2 different types of Geomancer in this deck, the forward and the backup. But the backup one is phenomenally good, because you can have, especially considering you can have more than one of them out, and because there's a lot of bounce effects in this deck, like putting stuff back in your opponent's hand, which is a very, very big synergy with Ultimecia, because it sets your opponent back 2 turns if they lose their guy back to the hand. And if it's a bigger guy, say a Sephiroth, we'll use Sephiroth as an example again, they've paid 8 into that Sephiroth, and it comes in tapped or dulled. If you then put it back in their hand, they've then got to pay that again for a guy that doesn't really do a lot that turn. Prish, you get around Prish in this deck doing that. You get around haste character creatures in this deck doing that. There's so many things that having, bounce effects and Ultimecia succeeds with, and that also works when you're being attacked, and that's where the Geomancer comes in. So when you're being attacked, you can use Geomancer's effect to look at the top card of the deck, go, that's an EX burst, that can stay on the top. Or go, that's not an EX burst, I'm going to put that on the bottom and hope that the next card is. And then there's just lots of little things, like at the end of your opponent's main phase, if you're pretty sure your opponent doesn't plan on doing anything else, you can check the top card of your deck and go, yeah, I want that next turn, I'm going to leave that on the top, or no, that's no good to me, I'm going to put it on the bottom. There's just so much versatility with this card, I had to put 3 copies of it in. I then put in 3 copies of Minwu, because the card's just good. I don't think that this card is meta-defining like a lot of people do. Yes, I think it's very strong against certain matchups, but I think that the key to a good deck build is to kind of spread yourself to a place where you can take on as many different deck archetypes as possible, and Minwu is a card that does that. And I just wanted to make sure that it was included, but I also wanted to make sure to note that Minwu is not an issue for this deck at all, because you don't deal damage in chips to your opponent's forwards. You either kill them, bounce them, or just ignore them entirely, and that is a big deal for this. Now the last of the water backups that I've put in here honestly saved my backside so many times. I cannot recommend this card enough, and it's 3 copies of Yoona, and this is the 5-drop Yoona that has an EX burst that has the same effect as Leviathan. Now Leviathan effect is really, really good because of obviously as I said earlier, it synergizes very well with Ultimecia. It synergizes very well with just keeping you alive for as long as possible, because your early game in this deck isn't fantastic. But not only that, but the secondary effect of Yoona to remove from the game anything that would go to the break zone from the field is actually very, very strong. I came up against a Golbez deck in round 4, and I came up against a Emperor of Darkness deck that was round 1, and round 5 I played against somebody who was running Emperor of Darkness, but he didn't actually play the Emperor that game because it went into his damage zone a lot. But the point still stands. Had he got Emperor of Darkness out, or if Golbez had hit the field, too early, that could provide a big problem for me, because his field ends up swarm. And I just want to make sure that that's something that I don't have to deal with. Veneal is another thing that this card counters. When I built this deck, I wanted to try and keep in mind as many different strategies as possible that can, impede what I'm trying to accomplish in controlling my opponent, because that's how most control decks work. I wanted to make sure that my opponent couldn't move, basically, and Yoona is a very, very integral piece of that. She did very, very well. She was definitely one of the best cards in this deck. You cannot run any less than 3 in this deck. I can't recommend it enough. And then going into the summons of the deck, they're kind of standard, honestly. One thing I saw a lot of, actually, while I was playing today, is that a lot of people are playing just 3 Moogles in, well, anything, really. So, even just for the EX burst. So, Fire and Lightning is just, just in case they take the damage. And I kind of get that. I get why you would do that. You have that ability to kind of just go, oh, I took a hit, but I plus out of it. That's nice. But in this deck, I actually used it in my turn more often than EX bursting it. I actually didn't see all that many EX bursts over the course of the day, which was kind of annoying, in all fairness. Oh, my screen's gone dark because I'm obviously spending too much time talking. But I've obviously got the deck messed up here, so I want to make sure I get it right. And then I'm running Leviathan as well, for obvious reasons. It's just a good card anyway. If you're running a water deck, you should probably run 3 copies of Leviathan, regardless of what else you're doing, because it's cheap, it's easy, and it gets things out of the way. A lot of people ask me why I don't run the 2-drop Yoona that makes Leviathan cheaper, and that's because that's all it does, and if I have that Yoona, I can't play the 5-drop one. And that's a big thing. I need that card out against a lot of matchups, so I decided just to not run that Yoona at all. However, you could skew this deck to run Yoona so that you could then make room for Tidus's if you wanted to try and change it to the way that you'd want to play it. And I'd encourage you guys to go and play this deck, because A, it's really fun, and B, it's actually got a lot of potential for change. When I built this deck, it was originally a fire-water deck, not an earth-water deck, but I ran Cloud anyway, and it just worked out very well for me. Though that you might not agree with it, and if you find a deck or a variant of this deck that you really like, then definitely let me know in the comments, or come find me on Facebook on the Final Fantasy TCG fan page. There's loads of things that you can do. I'll leave links to stuff in the description box, but definitely contact me and let me know what you think. Now we're going to go into the Earth cards now, and now the forwards in this deck. Earth, I think, has such a solid base to counter so many things, and it just fit this deck perfectly. As I said earlier, originally it was fire, but the fire and water just kind of made it look like the deck didn't really know which direction it wanted to go, whether it wanted to go aggro, whether it wanted to go control, but I wanted hard control, so I changed it. And the first thing that I noticed is actually very, very good with this deck is Sarahfey. Now I go on about how good this card is to a lot of people, purely for that turn 1 play of having a free 6k guy out. That's like, if your opponent is playing a wind deck, that is Zidane written off. You do not have to worry about Zidane at that point, because you've got a guy that just sits there and goes, come at me. Whereas the nice thing about it in this deck in particular is the thing that it synergizes very well with having Ultimecia and Cloud out at the same time. Now, if you have Ultimecia and Cloud out, having Ultimecia obviously means that their guys come indulged. Cloud has the ability to kill any guy. Now, so the way that Sarahfey works with this is if you've already used a Cloud to kill one of their guys, and you have Ultimecia ready for the next one, you can use Sarahfey to pick up one of the Clouds that you've discarded for the effect, and you don't care what they've picked up, because it's going to come in tapped and you're going to be able to deal with it regardless. You're still setting your opponent back those extra turns, and that's a massive thing. I used that a good 3 or 4 times over the course of the tournament, and it really did benefit me. Sarahfey is not a card to be underestimated. The card is very strong, and I very much recommend it to anybody. I don't think it's a card that I would ever consider taking out of this deck. Then the next card I put in was 3 copies of Prish, and I actually had to borrow a couple of copies of these Prishes because I just never could get hold of them, and I'm very thankful to my friend Sam who lent them to me. And they just did very, very well. She's actually a very, very good alternative to Cloud in this deck because she's a brave attacker. Having brave attackers next to Ultimecia helps so much because you don't have to worry about blocking because you've got guys to block with, and their guys are delayed. So you just keep applying pressure to your opponent using brave attackers because they're literally not having to commit any resources to hitting your opponent, and therefore you can use those resources to make sure that your opponent can't come for you. So it's a huge deal. Now, one of the cards that I was really surprised with in this deck was Cecil, and I wasn't surprised pleasantly. Now, I like Cecil as a card. I think it's a really, really strong card. Not once throughout that tournament did I want to see him in my hand. And I did not play the same deck twice throughout that tournament. I played aggro, I played kind of combo decks, I played all sorts of things, and not once did Cecil help me. Now, as somebody who thinks the card's really good, this shocked me. So, in hindsight, I wonder if maybe Cecil could have come out of it. I mean, I'll go over kind of the things that I would have changed at the end, but Cecil was one of the ones that really shocked me, though you may find it differently. You may think that Cecil was really good and that you'd want to keep him. And adversely, Guy, oh my lord, I want to run more copies of this card. He's like, Guy is bae. Guy is absolutely bae. And because he saved me. In my round 5, which was against an ice deck, I was getting hammered in the first few turns of the game through the 1-drop snow that dulls a guy when he attacks. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh god, I'm going to die really quickly if I don't do something. So I found myself having to fish using Moogles to find Guy, knowing that he would help. I didn't realise quite how much he would help though. You play a Guy, practically every strategy Ice has, particularly in combination with Minwu, falls down when they see a Guy and a Minwu. And, there are ways to get rid of him. I think he was playing water as well, so he could Leviathan it back to my hand, but I don't think he saw it. And there are ways around it, but Guy makes things very, very difficult for your opponent if they're playing an ice deck. So therefore, if anything, I would up this guy for more than one, because he was a tech play originally, and I thought, oh, he might not come in that handy. Again, Brave Attacker. 8k Brave Attacker for 4. He has the same numbers as Cloud. Therefore, this guy, he's just very strong. And I'm very, very happy with how he performed. So I definitely consider upping him in the future if I decide to run this deck again. Now the Earth backups get a little bit murky when everything is things. You could probably change a few things with this, but I'm actually quite happy with the lineup I have here. And the first thing I ran is a single Shantotto. Some people might want to consider running 2. I would even consider running 2 because this card saved my butt. And in the game that I played against the Windwater Final Fantasy X combo deck, I think it was round 3. The guy was lovely, really, really nice guy. And I saw a Shantotto go into my damage really early on, and I thought, crap, that's a card I now cannot deal with YRP Tidus. I now have to wait for Cloud of Darkness or just establish a board big enough that he can't break through me, which is eventually what I ended up having to do. And I had to stall out because Pain's drawing cards and Moogle's drawing cards and Brother is searching cards. That's how I thought, there's only one way I'm going to be able to really take this, and that's by decking the guy out, and that's what I did. And you kind of have to take the wins for what they are. It doesn't matter how you win at the end of the day, as long as you do it, but don't be a dick about it, because that's the most important thing. I say that winning is important. It's not as important as the way you put yourself across. And part of the reason I got out of card games for a very long time is because of people being not so nice. So be careful with your attitude when you play. That's all I wanted to put on that front. Anyways, moving on, because that's not what we're here to talk about. I wanted to play a single copy of the Monk, and the main reason I wanted to play Monk is because he's a 2-drop backup, that can get rid of himself when he's no longer needed, and his effect is useful. This card probably could be changed if you wanted to. You could change it to the Black Belt, or you could change it to a Kimari. I actually recommend Kimari quite heavily at the moment. This is the backup Kimari, because a lot of people are playing water at the moment, a lot, and therefore you're pretty much guaranteed for him to be a Cosmos or something that can, dull for any colour without actually having to sacrifice the ability to discard him for costs later or him being dead, because that's something that I would probably change in this deck. Mustadio, however, really big part of this deck, actually helped a hell of a lot in a lot of matchups, especially in combination with Ultimecia, because Ultimecia makes it so that all of your opponent's guys come in dulled. They have to wait until their next turn to use them. You then go, okay, I'm going to play a Mustadio and kill your old guy, so you've just spent your resources for nothing, and I'm going to start swinging at you with my Ultimecia. Because Ultimecia is so big as well, she's a 9k guy, 9k forward. Say she's 9k guide, she's not a guy, she's beautiful. And being able to swing at your opponent and start applying pressure with her can win you games, and then having Mustadio do that and make it so that their delay is longer, which is the entire purpose of this deck, is just make it so that everything your opponent does, without being cruel, turns out not to be very helpful and turns out a bit useless. And that's what control is in these games, and that's what you're trying to accomplish. There's no counter spells or anything in this game apart from that one ice backup, which I still don't think is all that great. You can just make it so that your opponent's game is just that much harder. They're just having to put in so much more effort and exhaust resources and cards in their hand to deal with something they wouldn't have had to deal with normally. Kefka actually does help a lot with this as well, and it doesn't sound like it would, but it does. Kefka himself, or having Kefka on the board, is more threatening than using him. Especially if you have like a Geomancer down, you can actually use Kefka on anything. The reason I say that is because Kefka is never used to attack. He's used to threaten your opponent. Say I have a Geomancer, and I attack with it, and you have a Cloud or something bigger than me, even something like Garland, who's pretty large, or a 9k base guy, Riku who has Hexproof. There's all sorts of things that you could counter with this. You attack with a Geomancer. Your opponent then has to gauge whether it's worth blocking him and risk losing their guy, even though you know you're going to lose yours. So it's almost like you're making your guy unblockable, and especially with a card like Geomancer, you can definitely use Kefka on him because you don't care if he dies later because you get cards out of doing it. So that you can definitely make those trades, and it makes a huge difference. And then lastly on this front is Tama. Tama is just amazing, fantastic card. The amount of times where I either don't know perhaps if they didn't spot the Tama or perhaps they just didn't realise how big a threat it would be. But I flashed in Prishes when my opponent was attacking me with big guys. I flashed in Shantoto more than once, and and there's nothing more satisfying than board wiping your opponent on their turn. It's a very strong play. But even flashing in an Ultimecia, where your opponent goes, they draw their cards, they go Moogle, they start setting their turn up, but they've already spent some resources that turn, so you can go, I'm going to flash in an Ultimecia now, your plans have to change. There's so many different little plays that you can do with him that I think is an instant staple for any Earth deck, straight up. And then for summons, I've again kept it really simple, is Hecaton, because it's not even to target any specific backup, but if you're on 3 backups and your opponent's on 2, you can just press the advantage so much with this card. You can just go, right, I'm going to set you back the turn that you've just spent getting your backup out. Say they dropped 2 cards for a Minwu, which shouldn't happen, but it does. Say they got a Yoona out. You just pick apart their strategies, particularly if they've got things like Yoona. FF10 combo is very popular, and that Yoona should be the more playable one. Therefore, you have to kind of bear a lot of things in mind when it comes to Hecaton, because there's so many things that are worth picking apart. Minwu is obviously one of them. Yoona is one of them. Kefka is one of them. There's so many good cards worth blowing up. You have to run 3 of it. And then but because it's not an EX burst, I had to make up for them in other ways. And there's actually 14 EX bursts in this deck. I always said it was 15 over the day, I was wrong. Because you've got Moogle, you have Leviathan, you have Sarahfey, and you have Mustadio. And then all of those cards do something worthwhile. And therefore, you've made up for the lack of EX bursts from your summons. So therefore, you can run your 3 Hecatons and not worry about it. I thought about running Vanille in this deck, but I realised that for this particular build, being able to just set your opponent back that extra turn by using Hecaton, you would never want to remove it for Vanille, so I decided against it. Now, the last thing that I ran in here was a couple of light cards and a fire card, actually. Now, I'm running a Cosmos. Something I've discovered over the last few days, and I've been testing, and particularly while I was playing yesterday, Chaos and Cosmos aren't nearly as good as I thought they were. I will happily admit I was wrong when I saw them. When I was in my first few videos, I said, oh, you're running more than one colour, you have to run Chaos and Cosmos. They're actually kind of crappy in the wrong time. They're only really useful kind of turn 1 and 2. If you draw them after that, you're kind of stuck with a dead card, because by that point you want to be playing bigger cards, or you want to be playing something that has an effect, Cosmos and Chaos don't do anything. They're just multicolored, and because of the way the game works, that's not as necessary as I first thought. So probably the first thing I would take this out of this deck if I were to rebuild it or change things would be Cosmos, and you could change Cosmos for Kamari, as I said earlier, because it does fulfill basically the same function, but at least it's not a dead card in your hand later. You can ditch Cosmos to Moogle, but that's literally the only way you can get it out of your hand. You can't discard it for costs. I actually wouldn't recommend Cosmos anymore, and I will happily admit that I was wrong to include it in this deck even. But luckily, it did come in handy, like in a couple of the earlier rounds where it was, it was helping me kind of mana fix and make sure my crystals were in the right levels. But it's up to you at the end of the day. You may feel differently from me, but over the course of the weekend, I was actually very disappointed with Cosmos. However, the other light card in this deck most definitely did not disappoint me, and that's because he's arguably the best card in the game, which is Light Cloud. 8k, brave, colourless, has abilities that blow up guys, and he synergizes with Ultimecia so perfectly that it's unbelievable. Your opponent cannot move if you have both of them out, to the point where I would argue that having an Ultimecia and a Cloud on the board at the same time at any point in the game could spell the game for you instantly. Your opponent gets set back so far by having their guys come indulged, having the threat of Ultimecia's S ability go off or Cloud's ability, while Cloud is just sitting there poking you in the face with his dirty great fucking pork sword, and he's just like, oh, you've got something that threatens me, I'll kill it. Okay, now try again in 2 turns later, I might be able to deal with that too. Oh look, a Sarahfey turned up, pick up the Cloud again, ditch it, kill your guy, start smacking you again. It becomes, dare I say it, effortless when they come out, and that almost sounds pretentious, but if you try it, you'll see that it works for you too. And it did very, very, very well for me, and I just think that Cloud is arguably the best card in the game. He's so versatile, he goes in literally anything, and as somebody who, even I thought that, you can only really run Cloud in a fire deck because his other copies are fire. You don't. You can run him in anything. And the Fire Cloud that I put in here was to add to consistency so that you were able to use the S effect much more frequently. And that extra Cloud actually does come in extremely handy, because the amount at which you draw in this game, especially in a deck like this that runs Moogle and Geomancer, you will see those Clouds. As long as they don't all go into your damage really early or something horrendously unlucky like that, the card is just obscenely powerful, and the major backbone of this deck is having our Queen Ultimecia and her bodyguard Cloud. So just try the deck out for yourself and see what you think. Okay, so that's pretty much all of the deck that I've gone over, and as I said, if I were to take anything out of this deck now, it would probably be Cosmos would definitely go, almost certainly. Cecil I would kind of and ah about, and I'm not sure. I never came across a matchup in which it was really useful, although now there are cards that he counters, like the 4-drop Lightning, early game beats from Tifa. There are things that she counters, but in all fairness, at the beginning of the game, you kind of want to get hit, because you want that large number of EX bursts to come into play so that you can start going, right, bounce your guy, get out of my way. Now my queen can come down, and you can just start slowing down at my pace now. But it's up to you. I mean, there are lots of alternatives that you could play. As I said at the sort of near the beginning of the video, Tidus could come into this deck quite happily, and it was something I toyed around with, where you can then have, because he turns himself into a brave attacker. But I'm actually a lot less keen on Tidus than everybody else is, because I think it's too easy to counter him. And because EX bursts are so prevalent, if you've discarded and you start smacking your opponent and an EX burst goes off that either bounces into his hand or kills him if it's Odin, or there's so many things you just go, I've just wasted loads of resources into that. I would much rather have a much more consistent build and slow the game down to my pace so that I can keep control of what's going on, than have an explosive play like Tidus, because I just think that he can be a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? He can be just a little bit inconsistent. That's not the only word I can think to use, and therefore I'd rather just use other things like Guy that can write off a colour almost by himself, or Sarahfey that allows me to keep my consistency up. But again, let me know in the comments below what you think, and I would really love to hear from you guys. I'm gonna kind of leave the video at this point because I'm exhausted. You know, I've been at work all day, and then yesterday was very, you know, it was extremely enjoyable, but it was long, and that building was warm, like really warm. It was, you know, we couldn't turn the aircon on because apparently the whole building would have needed it, and that's very expensive when we're the only people in there. But dear Lord, wearing a jumper and a coat and carrying my camera and carrying all my stuff with me, that was a mistake. But, you know, it was one of the most enjoyable events I've played in a very long time, and every opponent I played, everyone that came and spoke to me was so lovely and so genuine, and it really restored my faith in card gaming, if I'm perfectly honest. And the event was run brilliantly, all the staff were wonderful, I mean, the fact that the developers of the game were there and the creators, it was just it was a really magical day. And the fact that, you know, I came away kind of at the top of the food chain was just the icing on the cake. I could have gone, I didn't want to embarrass myself by losing every game, but I could have quite happily broken even and not cared. You know, I came away with my foily Sephiroth and everything, the new one, and I will definitely be wanting to build a deck and share that with you guys that involves that card, because I think he's very strong, and I think he opens up a lot of avenues for decks that may not have worked before, but definitely work now that there's ways of getting their barriers out of the way. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And I hope you really like the deck, and I hope that I definitely encourage you to go and try it for yourself. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and share this video out, because apparently it's a deck, you know, a tournament-winning deck. And, you know, don't overcharge for your Ultimecias. That's the one thing I did today. Don't overcharge for them. She's a really good card. There are lots of really good cards in this game. And, you know, just experiment, because that's what I did, and it works out really well. Anyways, I'm going to speak to you guys later. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. So I'll speak to you guys later. Bye.